ISO, the International Standardization Organization. And with me here as a panel today, I have Sarah, please, and I have Fiona.
Hello.
And Jan.
Hello.
Lee and Scott. And they will all now introduce themselves. We're starting with Scott at the far end here.
Oh, okay. Thank you. Good day, everybody. I'm Scott Steedman, Director General Standards at BSI, responsible for the UK National Standards Body and a member of the ISO Council and indeed the IEC Board, so heavily engaged in international standards development.
Lee, please.
Thank you. Lee White, I'm the Managing Director of the IFRS Foundation, and it's in that foundation that the International Sustainability Standards Board was created 2 years ago.
Hello everyone, my name is Sarah Mukherjee. I'm CEO of the Institute of Environmental Management and Assessment, or IEMA. We're the Global Sustainability Professionals Institute with more than 22,000 members in more than 104 countries, and we have members of our staff team very involved in the incredibly important standards process. Thank you.
Hi, good afternoon. My name is Fiona Watson. I'm a Senior Director in the Redefining Value team of WBCSD. So I think we win the prize for the longest acronym of institutions on the panel. So that's the World Business Council for Sustainable Development. Pleasure to be here. Thank you.
Okay. Jan?
I want to challenge that from the start. Well, if I'm going to full acronym, so United Nations Development Programme, Sustainable Finance Hub, Insurance and Risk Finance Facility.
Yeah,
So I'll be leaving now. Thank you very much. That was my contribution. Well, actually, so my name is Jan Kellett, and I lead UNDP's global work on insurance and risk financing, an area which could do with probably a little bit more standard setting, to be honest with you, when it comes to work on climate and development. That's probably what we'll talk about. Thank you.
Yes, that's exactly what we're going to talk about. And I think we all can have experienced a year with a lot of things happening around climate. There's been a lot of disasters around the world, I think in a pace that we've never really seen before, and in countries that never seen it before as well. So I think there is everybody realizes that this urgency is quite essential at this. And so we at ISO has also seen this, of course, and we have recognized that tools are, standards that we provide are great tools to use for things moving faster. So we have reached out to the world and said, simply use us. Take the standards that we have created that you can use as great tools to enhance and work faster to the goals that we want to achieve all around. But we couldn't do this alone, so we've also reached out to other organizations to see that we can work together, because it's also essential that we have basically the same language when we talk about standards, and we talk about standards in the same way, because it will be much easier to use them. And we also always have to have the end users in focus, because they are the ones that have to deliver. We can deliver standards, but they are the ones that have to deliver the change that will actually have an impact on the climate. So we have to have that in our minds. And I think that if we unite, act and deliver, as is the theme for this COP28, I think we could do something really great together. And this is what this panel is going to be all about. How can we use standards, and how can we cooperate to enhance the pace in which things are moving, because we have to move much faster. And one of the key elements in this, I think, is it sounds crazy really, but it's the accounting systems that we use in the companies. What do we report? And the companies there's been a lot of discussion, what is greenwashing, what are companies doing? So there has to be a standard really also for the sustainability reporting that comes out, so that we can compare, and that's so that investors also can realize the risk that are embedded in companies if they don't follow up on sustainability. So there's a lot of things here that comes together to create a movement forward. And so I will, of course, then start with Lee, because I've said for some time now that it will be the accountants that will change the world and drive climate change. So it's
Really?
Yes. So it's only natural for me to give you the first chance to explain how can we, ISO, help you do this work.
Lovely. So thank you very much. And No pressure with that sort of introduction, but I'll do my best. So colleagues, it was 2 years ago at COP26 where the IFRS Foundation made certain announcements regarding the creation of the International Sustainability Standards Board. And a lot has progressed in a 2-year period. And for those familiar with standard setting, sometimes it takes a little longer. But with the urgency that we could feel in the demand, particularly around climate, it was important for the foundation to move at pace. But to move at pace still with a level of rigour and due process in our standard setting. If I fast forward to June of this year, late June, 2 standards were actually released by the International Sustainability Standards Board, the first 2. S1 relating to general requirements of sustainability disclosure standards, and the second specifically relating to climate-related disclosures. We were really pleased to be able to issue these standards. We had a huge amount of consultation involved in it. And then we moved forward about a month to when IOSCO, the securities regulators, actually endorsed those 2 standards. Only the second time in 20 years had IOSCO endorsed standards. And what that meant from a regulator's perspective is that these standards were fit for purpose in the global capital markets. So some real milestones happening at fairly quick pace. And now our focus, and then I'll come to your specific question, our focus is all about the adoption and the use of those standards. Whether the adoption is top-down, coming from a jurisdictional approach via the government or the regulators saying, you know, we feel these standards are appropriate in our jurisdiction and we wish to use them from a specific date, mandating them, or more through a bottom-up approach, which is a voluntary adoption by the preparer community. Either way works well. We just want to make sure we've got standards that actually are in place and being used, because ultimately this is better information. If the light on the hill here is better information coming from these standards, which allow the capital markets to make better decisions and to allocate capital for the right purposes. So that's sort of, and I'm sorry, it's a bit of a fire hydrant of information, but that's where we sort of are today as we come into COP28. And our Chair of Trustees will be speaking more about this tomorrow, Erkki Liikanen. But if we come now specifically to how we can work with ISO. So we're at this point of adoption, but obviously ISO has invested heavily. Many corporates are already using the ISO standards. And we can certainly see through many of the standards, particularly ISO 14000, etc., are incredibly important in relating to the climate disclosures. So today we have made a press announcement. We have publicly stated about the commitment between the IFRS Foundation and ISO in order to advance both of our priorities, which we believe actually align very well. We're both focused on making sure that data can be captured correctly inside the organisations, and then that data presented through our disclosure standards. So there's actually just a really natural fit here in order to see how the 2 organisations, with their 2 separate mandates of standard setting and information gathering, can ultimately lead to better information for better decisions.
Yes, and that is why we're sitting on this panel today. But John, Lee mentioned the financial markets, the risks embedded in companies and such. This is something up your line, I think.
Thank you. Yes. Well, I mean, I'd like to hope so. I mean, first of all, as a note, I'm not going to speak to the notes that I was sent by my colleagues for our administry to speak about. I'm going to direct it more towards the insurance and risk financing side of things, if that's okay. So I think the first thing to say is, You know, if we just look at climate action in general, what needs to happen, there is a massive, massive shortfall, obviously, on the investment side and the protection side, financial resilience protection. Just to give you some examples, on the protection side, it's pretty clear for us. So if you just take sub-Saharan Africa, for example, only 3% of the population have any insurance over any aspect of their life or living. So basically 97 out of every 100 people have no insurance of any kind. It's the same actually for smallholder farming, which is a huge sector in sub-Saharan Africa. Only 3% have insurance of any kind. You can look at the same data when it comes to, if you like, large-scale insurance after disaster, which costs about $300 billion a year. In developed, thank you for that. In developed countries, you know, about 50% of that is on average insured. In developing countries, it's as little as 5 or 3%. So there's a huge amount of, if you like, a huge amount of lack, if I could put it like that. So that's on the one side. And then, of course, on the other side, we're aware of the, what is it $2 trillion that still needs to be spent, for example, on delivering the SDGs before 2030. And where is that? So the insurance industry has a massive part to play in this because, well, what they do is financial protection, first of all. It's interesting to see that in the 7 or 8 years since some of the major insurance, if you like, components of the development ecosystem started, which is essentially in Paris, the Insurance Development Forum, the Insurers Against Global Partnership, which UNDP co-chair and sort of co-founded, we've seen a plethora of initiatives. And I think this COP, it's the first time I've seen so many, you know, the Global Shield Against Climate Risk, the likely maybe funding or connections to the loss and damage debate, etc. So the insurance industry is definitely going to be part of this conversation, it is part of it. So this massive lack, if you like, well, that represents both an opportunity but also a challenge because the large part of it is essentially not standardized, or at least not standardized in the way in which targets exactly SDGs. I'm also thinking about the investment side. So the insurance industry has $40 trillion under management. That's what on the other side of the balance sheet where they make a lot of money. And just to give you an example well, it's about a third of the entire world's capital. That's worthwhile of a note. And of course, some of the largest companies in the world. We did an analysis of European insurers to see, well, where was this money going and where was it being spent? And we found out that only 2.5% of European insurers invest any of their assets under management outside of Europe, essentially, or outside of developing countries, or developed countries, so not quite Europe. So, and the farthest they go is probably the Balkans, and really no further. So again, this represents a massive gap when it comes to delivering on the SDGs and delivering climate action, but as I said, a massive challenge. When it comes to standards and standard setting. Now, there are a couple of initiatives which have been put in place, but I'm not sure whether or not they've had a huge traction, not when it comes to working really, if you like, at the coalface in developing countries. So there's one which is developed by our friends and partners over at UNFI, which is with the large-scale insurers setting standards for what is an appropriate product, if you like. And probably one of the most interesting ones is the ones which the International Federation of Mutuals and Cooperative Insurers have just launched with Swiss Re to bring standards to the mutual and cooperative insurers. That's quite interesting for us working on climate action because mutuals and cooperatives quite often owned, it's in the name, by the actual policyholders themselves and very close to, you know, what it means to experience risk. There are also about 900 million mutual and cooperative policyholders around the world, so it's a very influential group. So in upshot, if you like, what I see from my sector is we have massive needs, that's point one, and we have massive more likely engagement from the insurance sector, and they're being called upon to engage. That's going to bring lots of opportunities, a lot of risk capital and a lot of actual capital, investment capital to the table. But a large part of this is relatively unstandardized, or it's standardized in ways which are piecemeal, driven by their own companies' ESG standards, for example, but maybe nothing which is particularly harmonized. And I think that's the way we need to go as a community.
Thank you very much for that. Then coming down to the actually ones who has to do all this and implement all this and think about it in the everyday life, Fiona. This is something that your group is probably working quite a bit with.
Yes. It's true to say. So I'm trying to take the mic off the stand because it is quite a hunched presentation, but yes. I can't manage that. So I'm going to do this contorted position. So yes, thank you. So World Business Council Sustainability, we work with about 230 of the world's largest companies. All of them are facing incredible challenges with this agenda. All of them, all of their supply chain, their value chain, their partners, all of them. This is a systemic issue, but it's critical because hearing Lee talk about the need and the drive and the demand for standards from the investor community in particular for the capital markets, and hearing Jan talk about the mispricing in the system, there's a disconnect. And corporates, frankly, sit right in the middle of that right now. So whilst they look down, it's an unfortunate metaphor, but I'm going to run with it, while they look down the barrel of this agenda and see these incoming standards from left and right, particularly multinationals, who are facing European requirements, US requirements, hopefully soon, new standards in APAC, it's a global issue. So while they're trying to juggle all that, analyze it and condense it into something that makes sense, they need to shift mindsets, they need to shift functions, they need to make radical changes to the way they work, drive new ways of working within the large corporations, make huge investments in data, huge investments in supply chain changes, huge investments potentially in business model changes as a result. But at the moment, because of this misalignment, the business case is not clear. And that's extra challenging. So we get real headwinds from the capital markets. We get mixed messages from, frankly, regulators and politicians. So it's a very challenging environment, and it's a time where we need standardization and collaboration more than anything. So we think about it in terms of a corporate performance and accountability system, because I know we didn't need another acronym, but it does pull together a lot of these and the consequentiality of it. So it's something that our CEO and President, Peter Bakker, put out on Thursday this week. And we find it as a very easy mental model for thinking about where these different challenges come in. Because one more point, and then happy to defer, but it's not just corporate reporting where this is happening. It's happening at a product level. It's happening at a process level. The regulatory changes that are rightly coming through the system to drive sustainability practice are 360 degrees. So it puts enormous pressure on companies. And unfortunately, it's driving a compliance mindset. And we think that's actually the last thing you need. What we need is a beyond compliance mindset that pushes it beyond it. So anything we can do to take the friction out of the system, to simplify it, make it more efficient and more certain for those users of the information and the providers of the information is critical.
Yes, I think we've all realized that, and that is why all cooperation between the different organizations, standard setters, and so is so crucial at this moment.
Absolutely.
I think it would be great to have some local issues here. Scott, you're heading BSI, UK organization for standardization. Do you see on the local level problems with this, with the companies and organizations you meet every day?
Well, thank you, Ulrika. We pivoted into this space some years ago now, realizing the issues that have just been flagged by Lee and Fiona, particularly this gap between the world of financial reporting, regulatory requirements, jurisdictions, and the world of industry, product and process, just exactly what Fiona said a minute ago. So for over 150 years, industry globally has been working on its common currency, the standards that were used, sometimes as specifications, sometimes as best practice, to improve the quality of their business performance. They did that through ISO, they did that through the IEC, they did that at national level, they did that at regional level, and over the last few decades, that has converged in a quite remarkable way. And you'll see the adoption and use of those standards by our fellow standards bodies around the world as national standards very commonly now. So industry in their supply chains, in their value chains, are relying on these industry standards for product and process. And meanwhile, as Lee has so eloquently explained, from a financial reporting perspective, there's been a real urgent need to develop, and I'll use the word develop rather than set, standards that will accommodate the new requirements for non-financial reporting, but building on that massive experience of accounting standards that the world has known itself for well over 100 years. So whilst industry has served its jurisdictions in terms of product safety and performance, and finance has served its jurisdictions in terms of financial reporting, we've never had the kind of glue in the middle that brought this together. And the conversation we're having now and the imperative of addressing climate change and providing a consistent and coherent body of information drove us in the UK to really think rapidly about this. We pivoted, first of all, Ulrika, at our group level into sustainability as core to our strategy as a national standards body. We operate completely globally. I'm responsible for a body of standards that's between 50 and 70,000 standards. We're working on 7,000 standards at any one time. It's a big business for industry. But what we were trying to achieve was an alignment of all of those industry standards that have grown bottom up with the sort of top-down direction of travel that we can see coming, the need for the net zero transition. So in 2021, actually I think when we first met, Ulrika, we proposed to the ISO community that we might commit that international standards should be looked at again in a priority sequence to identify those that could have a large impact and where subtle changes to the language would align and make consistent the terminology, the data, the information that these standards were producing in practice. And we called that the London Declaration. That's now happening. I've never seen anything like it. We invested in a team to support our own objectives, to build that top-level story, which became known as the ISO Net Zero Guidelines. The one document I urge you all to download and read. It's very, very easy and very, very helpful. It doesn't tell you how to do anything, but it is trying to say these are the core principles and the terminology that you need to use. So beginning to fill that gap between the historic world of financial reporting and the historic practices of industry reporting. And then beyond that, we work with our own government, with the TPT, Transition Plan Task Force that was set up by Treasury in the United Kingdom to support their understanding of the development of standard. And they are now working very closely with us, which is great news. And we've gone on from that to develop more of that kind of interfacing standards to support the announcement that Lee's just been referring to, so that we can help companies transition using their existing standards base, so not retooling because somebody's invented new standards, adapting their existing body of standards, making sure that the data and information flow that comes from that is consistent with multiple jurisdictions, Ulrika. What's key to this is that we will never have harmonized regulatory requirements around the world. We have to understand that. But industry wants to be able to plug and play. The data that they produce from their processes, their products, can just be cut and pasted into whatever reporting requirements are needed. That's the goal here, what I once called a Rosetta Stone type of standard. So our work here has been to support our government to understand the role of international standards, how we can adapt, how we're working at the global level through ISO and IEC and with other partner organizations. And I'm really excited, Lee, to meet you and to hear about the announcement today, because this is finally a turning point, actually, in the history of global business.
It is. And we're so happy that we achieved it. With all the things you heard now, Sarah, how do we then, at the end of the day, create accountability, credibility to everybody who is using all these numbers that are in the report?
Excellent question. Yes. I'll defer to my colleagues. No, I won't. Excellent question. And listening to this, I mean, we as an organisation bridge activism, business, individual membership, and passion. And I think we need to do more to try and link the passion of climate action with the certainty of standards. Now, hands up, who was at the Earth Summit? I've got to take my glasses off, in 1992. Yeah, if you were there, you probably, if you were there and you didn't drink the Caprinas, you might remember it. If you did drink the Caprinas, you probably didn't, to be perfectly honest. But the outpouring of emotion, of passion, of activism at that point, everybody really wanted to get this stuff over the line. It was an incredible moment where everybody, all sectors came together. Just after the Berlin Wall came down, a huge geopolitical change. And then, of course, people sat down and thought, hang on a second, we can't do just this with passion alone. That's not going to get over the line. We need certainty. We need standards and regulations. And we've gone from there to, now I was sitting in a meeting this morning where you've got the normal kind of tsunami of acronyms. You're clinging on by your fingertips trying to remember what all this stuff means. But what it means is sharing a common language that we can all work around and work together with. Now, I'm a Brit speaker. We might have some Americans in the audience. We all know those amazingly funny things that happens, like with rubbers, because that means an eraser in Britain, and it doesn't mean that in America, I know. But being able to find a common language around standards is absolutely fundamental. We talk a lot about sustainability and resilience, and we all might mean something slightly different from that. Without a common standard and a common framework, we are not going to get where we need to. We all talk about data, how much data there is and how little of it is actually consistent. And for me, and I guess I would say this as a professional institute CEO, but this has to be around education as well. Unless we are all trained to the same standards and talk in the same language around those standards, we are still going to ultimately fail. And just before I hand back to the chair, I'd like to pick up one of Jan's points about flooding. And it's back to this passion. I used to be a BBC environment correspondent, and I spent a lot of time reporting on people being flooded out. And it's like a bereavement. It's not a piece of land, it's not an insurance claim, it's not a bit of paper. I sat with a lady in her 70s who had been flooded in York, and she was catatonic. She couldn't sit, she was sitting in her armchair in her garden from her flooded house, unable to talk. She was so shocked. That is the actual practical impact on every person who is flooded, every farmer in sub-Saharan Africa whose crops are washed away and so they can't take their kids to school the next year. So we need to remember why we're doing this and why it's so important that we have these standards to allow ourselves to make a better world. Thank you.
I saw you nodding, Jan, and I know you have to leave in a couple of minutes because you have another session to attend, but would you like to comment some of this before you leave? You talked about the insurance business, but there is also some demands on the financial business to report what they actually have in their books, where their stakeholders have in their books and such. And that is also, I think, very important because it's all about the money at the end of the day, isn't it?
Yes, I mean, I think the sort of top line part of this, from my perspective, would be that there does seem to be a lack of transparency at the heart of this. So there's a lot of talk about ESG and there's a lot of talk about standards. One of the things I was going to talk, maybe sort of Scott, it is at the end there. Is that right, Scott? I was thinking when you were talking, for example, just a slightly different point was, standards within standards in a sense. Our standards are here and your standards are there. How do you get those guys to talk to each other? That's for me a slightly separate point. Competing standards, should we say. And we do a lot of work, for example, in the Gulf now, and the standard setting here is even coming with a very different language and even very different rules. For example, you have, for insurance, you have something called takaful, which essentially is insurance which follows Sharia, because you cannot make money from money as a normal insurer would. So these other things complicating your standard setting life. Anyway, but I think it's part of the bigger picture of how we wrangle, if you like, some of these core industry partners, if I could even word it like that, and perhaps I would. I think there's a long way to go for the banking and finance industry to actually really, truly follow the rhetoric that we see in and around announcements and launches and pledges. And I think that's one of the tricks. And can standards actually be the thing that does it? Which sounds a little bit boring. Am I allowed to say that to this audience? If I may say. I mean, the floods thing is an interesting piece because you might come back to that. How can you connect the individual experience of a person to the standard being set up the line down, agreed by a CEO in the City of London and Frankfurt or whatever, about having the right kind of product which would relieve the burden of this person in some way. There's a huge lot of things between there. So maybe the thing to ask ourselves is how can standards actually be the trick to unlock better transparency, but actually deliver things which make a difference for people?
I could pick that up, Ulrika.
I think you're so right. And within ISO, we try to do that by having a dialogue with the consumer organizations of the world, because that's how we reach out. And there's more to do on this. Absolutely. Totally agree. Totally. Thank you for joining us,
Thank you
Jan.
very much.
Thank you very much for joining us. I think we'll give Jan a hand before he leaves.
Ulrika, I could pick up.
Yeah. Please, Scott, you wanted to comment?
Yes, I just wanted to build on that very interesting comment. And I remember sitting a few years ago in London in a bar in the city, and the gentleman opposite me was saying that the capital markets were the last great unstandardized field of business. And perhaps that's just what we're hearing. I was in a session on capital and insurance risk markets last week, and the chair was there talking about standardization of standards. I said, I don't like the word standardization because it implies making things the same. And the world is never going to be made the same. But what we've learned in the world of formal standards making based on stakeholders is how to engage with all voices and how to avoid the problem of competing standards by working together on a common issue at a national level, at a regional level, and now fully at a global level. The ISO organization was founded in the aftermath of the Second World War, when the UN again realized that there was a need for a convergence of opinions from countries all around the world, and it set up the ISO organization as that process to bring national delegations together. So we feel very passionately within ISO, the ISO members, that our job is to ensure that all voices are represented in the shaping and developing of standards. Again, I'm not going to use the word set because it comes to the point made earlier that set drives a compliance mindset, which is completely unhelpful. Obviously, there are requirements that one needs to meet, the speed limit, for example, but where a standard is set. But let's not think of it like that. Think of using standards to drive performance improvement, using standards to drive your advantage, to drive your net zero transition, to drive your energy management, to drive your social issues in terms of social responsibility. So we have built mechanisms within the standards community to address this historic problem of competing standards, and to avoid it, frankly, by partnering, by sharing, by understanding, well, you know, you're doing that piece, we'll do this piece. But the critical thing is the attributes that you bring. It's very easy to go into a room and write a standard, but where is the governance and where is the representation? When that standard is used by a regulator or used by a chief executive, the first thing to say is, what is the provenance of that standard and how is it being maintained, and what do I need for the purpose that I'm trying to address? If it's a common currency for the world to address net zero, you want all voices heard and you want national representations, and you want to be sure that that is going to be maintained in perpetuity, not just published and thrown on the internet and imagining it's somehow going to keep going. So we've built mechanisms to do this for industry, and as I say, it's a very substantial type of work, and those standards are used and adopted by countries all over the world as their national standards, as their regional standards, and as global standards. So they provide an incredibly powerful engine for global value chains to navigate this particular challenging time in world history. So if we can, Lee, if we can converge and align and bring our experience in how you get voices heard and how you build standards that can support and dock, shall we say, plug and play, that phrase, plug and play with the financial reporting requirements and the audit world, I think we're going to be onto something really quite big.
Well, I agree with you, but I would like to ask you, Lee, I mean, IFRS have evolved the financial reporting systems over years, and I don't think it has been all voices heard and everybody taking part when IFRS changes its accounting principles. But it goes massively all over the world. Nobody questions you we might say, good God, here they go again. Do we have to change it? And
I think they do.
Yeah, I remember when IFRS 16 came on and I was, oh, terrible, terrible, terrible. But it doesn't matter, we do it. So how do you achieve this? Is it the strength of the auditors actually that pushes it? Be honest.
It's a good question.
Be honest.
I will be.
Yeah.
I will be. But perhaps if I may just reflect on two things, the
Yeah.
speakers, and then come to your broader question. So Fiona was talking about the challenge with a compliance mindset, and fully agree. And Scott, you were really deep into sort of that discussion about value as well. So we've got to be really clear here that in using S1 and S2, there is a real drive to the value proposition of using these standards. Otherwise, if there is a tendency to slip into compliance, which there is a natural tendency to do, we won't get anywhere near what we're wishing to achieve. And just as a small example, both S1 and S2 are asking for the disclosures of risks, which is natural, people often go there, but as well opportunities. And one area that we'll be driving hard on is to making sure that there is sufficient of the opportunities being disclosed in S1 and S2, not just the risk, because I think the risk focus is important, but it takes you deeply back to more of a compliance mindset. So to your question then, Chair, I think the secret for the IFRS Foundation, which has had a 20-plus year history of success, and I note the comment about 16, and I'd slip in even IFRS 17 for that matter as well. But I think there's a level of confidence in what is produced by, in that board, the IASB, has been around its transparency. So let me just be really clear here. All board papers come before every board meeting. You can come on our website, see those board papers in advance of the meeting. If you wish to, you can watch every second, every minute of a board meeting. I'm not sure I'd say do all that, but nevertheless, it's there. So that sense of transparency really allows them, people that involve, consult, say, my voice was heard. And for most, my voice was heard doesn't always equate to my voice was followed or my voice was adopted, but the strength of my voice was heard is incredibly important. And just to round that off then, Chair, that in the lead up to the creation of the ISSB in late 2021, you know, the consultation that the trustees did was extensive and thorough, global, but very clearly one of the drivers for the demand for the trustees to serve by creating the new board was about the due process. So not only is it the transparency, it's the process in which people can follow exactly how the standard is being developed. And in that, it leads to a lot of confidence. So at times when you feel, I wouldn't have gone there, they should have done something different, I think most of the time people will say at least, I sort of understand how they've got there.
So there is an openness. Sorry, Fiona, please, you wanted to comment something.
I've been bubbling away on this credibility point, which Lee has actually done a great job of taking further from prior comments, because we have the session on credible and accountable, and I think it's worth double-clicking on the imperative of credibility, because that's what's missing right now. And that's what's driving the focus on rhetoric on greenwashing, and now green hushing, and green whatever else, but not green doing. And that's the big problem. So I think the process and the governance around the formulation of the IFRS and ISSB standards has been critical in getting the credibility of the preparer community, which is something that we're building on. We have a preparer forum for sustainability disclosures to help work and adopt, because these are challenging. It hasn't been done before. There is new best practice. There's no right or wrong at the moment, except the right way forward is a beyond compliance approach. But then critically, distilling all this down into the poor lady whose room has been flooded, it has to lend itself to a credible system in which she can confidently buy insurance at a reasonable price point to protect her livelihood. And so it's really important that we track that credibility right through the system, because it's not there and it's needed urgently.
I totally agree. Sarah?
Yeah, I was going to make a very similar point actually around...
Great minds.
I was really interested in your point, Lee, about transparency, because I do think, not just from a business point of view, and we work with businesses who've shared a lot of your concerns about, you know, which standard is the right standard, and there's always another initiative coming from another government. Yeah. But not only that, but transparency for people, for this lady who's been flooded, for the small business, and for the person in the Sahel who's not even got access to insurance yet. And why would they at the moment in terms of what the obvious benefits are? So there's a thought there around democratising, but also being really clear about what we want the outcomes to be from these incredibly important pieces of work that everybody's doing.
Well, it's all about accountability and credibility, isn't it? Because otherwise we will stay in the greenwashing area always and not coming out of it. And this whole transition is to come out of it and have the real data in the reports. Scott?
Thank you, Ulrika. I wanted to pick up on that green doing thought and suggest that we had a little circle around there about different forms of standard. Do you know what? They're all valid. Mm-hmm. Transparency is critical, but they're all valid. And I'll illustrate that. You asked me earlier, Ulrika, what we were doing in the UK. One of the things that we're really doing is to strengthen our quality infrastructure. Because industry for a very long time has had to demonstrate its doing without washing, and the new layer on top is caused by this dysfunctional structure of standards and reporting, and demystifying that is really very important. But underpinning all of the industrial system in all our countries exists what is called a quality infrastructure. Not a very sexy term, I accept, but the quality infrastructure is made up of that layer of market surveillance, standards, accreditation, and metrology. And all of those institutions exist in every single country, and they have the responsibility for ensuring that companies are doing what they said they were doing, whether that was voluntary or mandatory, and that the engine is well oiled. So I would say that we can build on that, and the concept that Lee is describing there is simply another part of that infrastructure. You have your ways in the IFRS of doing stuff in a very well-governed process. When we're in the world of metrology, which is about the measurement side, we don't need all voices heard. The measurement of time, for example, for financial transactions is not best done by consumers, it's best done by global scientists working out how to define time. So in these types of metrological standards, you have one set of voices. In financial reporting, another set of voices, the accountants who know how to do that best. In industry standards, you do want all stakeholders heard because you are affecting the lives of consumers who are being flooded or buying substandard products. And then in accreditation, you have the structure by which industry itself is having its claims verified. So these structures all exist today. And in going forward to green doing, I would really suggest that one of the actions we want to take is to bring in to the House the conformity assessment community, the accreditation community, as well as the standards making community, because these are the tools by which industry builds confidence with its supply chain, with its investors, and with its regulators.
Yeah. Absolutely true. Does anyone want to comment? You look like you wanted to comment, Fiona.
Yes, but what I was, defer to you, Chair, I was going to take it to a level of detail to illustrate it. Just a couple of minutes, because we all agreed, I think, on the concepts and the imperative of credibility, but just maybe to illustrate of where the current disconnects are tracking through and how problematic that is for the green doing. We have a situation with Scope 3 carbon accounting, which I'll just assume a working familiarity with, probably far in excess of mine. And we have a situation where we have large business members in a B2B supply chain who are keen to decarbonize their products. And so they focus at a product level on the decarbonization impact of that product. But they are selling to a company that is currently doing an aggregated Scope 3 emissions accounting. So even if that company is including a third-party product in its Scope 3, which may not be, it's then difficult to have a commercial discussion with the supplier to give them the business case and the confidence to invest in that decarbonization. Because until the decarbonization reflects in the averages, it's not there, it's almost invisible. So you see where these disincentives are coming in through the system. So yes, it's detailed and technical and a bit boring, and it gets people like us who like this stuff going, but it doesn't necessarily mean much to the man on the street or lady on the street. It's having a very real impact, and it's a chilling effect on exactly the behaviors that we need.
Yes, absolutely. And I can give you another example from my own world where I'm sharing a real estate company. And we thought, because we're not public, we could have, lay back a bit before and see everybody else doing the mistakes which they can. And then we suddenly realized we can't, because all our tenants want the information for their annual report. So we had to speed up and work really, really fast to get there. And this becomes, and I think that's the crucial point, if we do it in a good way, that is credible, accountable, this becomes a selling point for us.
Yep.
So everybody can rely on the figures that we provide for our tenants, and that makes us more popular on the market. So I think that everybody has to use this in a way also to prove that this is good business. It's not something that is imposed on you, but something that you can use for good business. I see you standing there with a microphone. Maybe there is a question from the audience before we close this session.
There's 3 over here.
See? Yeah?
Oh my
Four.
goodness, yeah.
Well,
Just while the microphone's moving, we work with a lot of SMEs recently, purely because of this whole Scope 3 thing. They're being asked by the people they supply into their supply chains to begin to really investigate what their emissions are to help that carbon accounting.
Yeah.
So yes, you're right, it is a powerful mover.
Thank you.
So, yes, please.
Yes, thank you for this talk. It's really interesting. I'm Julia from KPMG Chile. I'm from South America. We are also agree with you that if your IFRS is reaching all over the world, it reaches us. But I want Lee advice on how to connect this new challenge that we had, because we are an ESG team that now has to talk with the assurance team that's mainly accountable and accountants, and how can we work together, how can we integrate the information so we can really apply the rules, the new S1 and S2, and how can we build an integrated team and not 2 layers of our brain, right? That we have been working like that since a couple of years ago. So thank you for that.
Please.
Thank you. I think it was Juliet. So, Juliet, thank you very much for that question. And I can confess I'm an ex-auditor, so some of my DNA is not that dissimilar. And I think the key here is this is quite different. So I think the auditors, the assurance providers need to just pause and not go into their natural state of, I understand how this will work because I've assured financial statements for many years, I understand internal controls and so forth. So I think the key element is to start with a sentiment that the ESG disclosures under S1 and S2 are going to be disclosures they're not used to providing assurance on. They're generally used to finding data quite easily and available. That won't be always the case. And so coming with a real sense of there is transformation happening here and actually starting to recalibrate their skills and their competencies, because the assurance profession has many. It's underpinned by a very strong sense of ethical considerations, but they can't just simply say we're going to do the same again, because the disclosures, as I was saying earlier, under S1 and S2, very much around the value proposition of the business models, are elements that the auditors will need to start thinking about in a very different mindset to where they may be. Hopefully I'm not stereotyping my ex-profession, but it's a wonderful opportunity too. It's a wonderful opportunity to rethink the approach. And I have said a few times, I know this isn't going to happen, but I'd love to be starting my career again. I think it's a really, really special time to do it, yeah. So thank you.
So if we have short questions and short answers, yes, we will have time for more because we have to evacuate. Please.
Thank you. My name is Marcio Viegas. I'm the founder and managing director of Sustain. I spent almost 20 years in the ISO world. And my last job was at BSI. And then I moved into the ESG, now sustainability reporting especially world. So I'm very delighted to see this meeting happening, first of all. And my two questions are, first, now that IFRS very quickly, and Scott, it's not easy to write standards, it takes 3 to 5 years. They did that in 2 years. We have 2 standards now, S1 and S2. So now that you have the financial standards, and bodies like IFRS in Europe are writing quite technical standards, my question is, what's the role of ISO in this new reporting environment? And how quick can ISO move to write new standards in that realm? Thank you very much.
May I just quickly jump in and deal with that?
Yes, quickly.
So we can write standards as fast as you can agree what you want in it. That is my pledge to you. We did the net zero guidelines for ISO in 4 months. We have a process in BSI that we run in 4 weeks. We have processes to suit the type of consensus you need to reach. If you want the whole world and everybody to agree, that will take a little time. But if we want something to get going, get moving, I will do it, we will do it in ISO as fast as you can agree it.
Yes. And to give you the answer on EFRAG, yes, we are working with EFRAG as well. It's going on. I was looking here at Marco, who I know have met EFRAG several times. So, and Sarah, you wanted
just
to...
very quickly on the previous lady's excellent point. I mean, for me, and to Lee's point as well, that underlines the need for joint training. I mean, we are working as fast as we can with other organisations. No one has all the bandwidth to work in this space, but as we always say, every job will be a green job in the future. So we have to make sure that we have a common understanding across professions about what ESG means and sustainability. Thank you.
Hi, my name's Wendy Miles and I'm here as Vice Chair for the International Chamber of Commerce Commission on Environment and Energy. I'm also a lawyer. I have a question about money and in particular about the accounting standards, the auditing standards and the valuation standards. Now I know ISO doesn't have overarching financial standards, although it does have financial environmental standards. My question is this: does this new cooperation in any way give you the platform, the mandate, the opportunity to work with accountants, auditors and valuers to make sure that they actually value and account for the current cost of climate in their assets and in their business statements, because it's not there. We know it's not there.
You want to... Could I just give a general point while Lee is thinking? And I think when it comes to investors today, they would like to see the climate risk. Last year at COP, I attended such a session, and it was evident that the investors, all the different pensions funds and everywhere, wanted to see the climate risks that were in the scopes. And they pointed, actually, I was very proud at the time, at ISO to sort of also provide some credibility on those areas. So that is something that we have to look into. I think we do, absolutely.
Lee, do you want to pick it up?
Oh, here's somebody. Yes, I'll see you. Please.
Hi, Ted Waddle from Visa. To pick up on a quick point that you raised about the Transition Plan Task Force in the UK, any just general sense or prognostication about the development of standards around transition plans and transition planning?
Yes, absolutely. We have one in process today. Working with the TPT, we recognise there's a gap, and a particular gap for SMEs who don't know what they're supposed to do. They can look at these big things, but they don't know how do I take steps. So we are developing a fast-track standard today to help SMEs to interpret and use the TPT reporting structures.
Okay. Lee, you wanted to come.
That's fine, Chair. It's quite a detailed question, and I'm trying to just think of the best way, but perhaps I could just come back. A lot of the responses the trustees received about the creation of the ISSB was all about the connectivity with financial reporting. That's why it's in the one house, if I could say. 2 boards, 1 foundation, and in that way I think we will be very optimistic about how each board informs each other going forward.
And maybe one day there's an opportunity for that community to use the ISO processes to reach stakeholders they wouldn't normally reach.
Yep.
So it's just a process matter.
We've got a lady here who's been very keen, Andy. And if we're pretty quick, we'll have one more question, please.
Hi, my name is Aslisha. I'm a climate lead specialist at Novozymes. Just one remark. It's great that we definitely need standardized standards across a lot of the accountability frameworks, especially from a Scope 3 and a climate action perspective. But we shouldn't miss the point of also working on getting the right, reliable, comparable data, because that doesn't exist for Scope 3. And without that, the standards can't really help us take climate action. So given the urgency of the work that we need to do, it's really important that we also focus on the data at the same time, especially at a farm level.
I think we all agree. Fiona, you wanted a quick comment?
Completely agree. And so quick applause for the Net Zero Public Data Utility that was put out this week. And I think that, or the prototype, that is a classic example, a great example of the type of collaboration and accessible sources that we need, especially for the SME community. So yes, completely agree.
I would completely agree. The trouble is, though, and this is businesses as well, everybody says they want open and accessible data. Very few people are prepared to actually genuinely give it up.
Well, they'll take it, they won't give it.
But we don't have a single point of truth regionally, nationally or internationally at the moment. You're absolutely right.
Very shortly.
Thank you. IFRS Foundation working very much with CDP. They're loading up S2, so we'll get a huge amount of data starting to come through.
Yeah. Last questions. Pretty quick, because we have to get out.
Absolutely, very quickly. Hi, my name is Carlene Winter. I'm with Albright Stonebridge Group in our sustainability practice, and I'm wondering, especially from Fiona, but also from Lee, you said that we can watch hours and hours of board meetings, which is fantastic, and I know that we can submit consultations to hear from consumers and producers and, more so advocate for those voices being heard. But what is the recommendation for MNCs or even the average consumer to be able to submit their thoughts on regulations, whether they're jurisdictions, regulators themselves, or trade associations, other bodies?
So,
Fiona?
it will vary very much by jurisdiction, but I think Lee would welcome an individual consultation response. And if there are individuals in the system who want to participate, most of the frameworks that I know would accommodate that. EFRAG, IFRS, BSI. So I think the challenge is obviously that these are incredibly technical. So what my concern is, to some extent, not speaking on behalf of the consumer community, but the level of awareness in the system of the significance of these standards is not yet there. And I think that's challenging. The significance of these standards within large corporations is not understood. So there's a huge awareness building exercise that needs to happen as well. And if that then spun off informed constructive participation in the process, fantastic.
Okay, thank you. Thank you for all your questions from the audience as well. And I think that we leave this with a sense of that we have to collaborate.
Absolutely.
We have to get to the common language that we can use, all of us, within this, and that we do really need to cooperate to achieve all that, because it's all about that what we want to achieve is the accountability and credibility for the system, and that is why we have to work together. Thank you very much, everybody, for attending and coming.
Thank you.
Good on you, mate.
Okay.
I'll send you a note.
Hey,
I'll
Ulrika.
send you a note, and we'll catch up when I'm back in London.
Very handy. Thanks.
Scott?
Brilliant.
Hello, Chair.
Fantastic.
It was good fun.
Totally. Well, we've got a campaign.